It's great that all these people can connect from all over. I teach as an instructor and I so prefer in person, but I understand the value of things like this as well, because we can connect with so many people rather than bringing you all here to campus to Blacksburg to hear me talk. So certainly value in this. I just prefer the like face-to-face interaction with students. So that said, as I go through this, I mean, I do have a PowerPoint presentation. It's like 50 something slides long, so I'll have to move kind of quickly. I think we'll get through it, but feel free to interject. I don't know, Devin, if they have the ability. I guess everybody's probably muted, but they can type into chat. So if I don't see that, if a question comes in, I'm happy to stop and answer that as we go through. You certainly don't have to wait till the end to ask questions. So feel free to do that. As Devin said, I'm an instructor here in the School of Plant Environmental Sciences. I started teaching in January of 2020, just before COVID hit the area here. So I've had some interesting teaching experience teaching through COVID. I'm certainly glad that we're on the other side of that. We're back to in-person learning, as you see in this picture here on my first slide. I teach a variety of horticulture classes. I teach indoor plants, plant propagation, herbaceous landscape plants, greenhouse management, which actually this fall is now greenhouse and controlled environment ag management, an ornamental plant production and marketing class, and am developing a brand new class that I'll teach for the first time in the spring that is production of food crops in controlled environment ag. So very relevant, highly relevant to what we're talking about today. Because historically, students here at Virginia Tech have not had any exposure to hydroponics. We just sort of mentioned it in a couple of classes. And so the past couple of falls, I've taught a lab with greenhouse management. That's the picture you see here, where students, I mean, look at these students' faces. Like they're I mean, look at this guy. He's just like blown away by, and this girl right here, just blown away by growing this hydroponic lettuce in the greenhouse. And so I'm so happy to be able to share these experiences with students and have them have these hands-on opportunities. So just one last thing before I actually get into my presentation. I promise I really will talk to you about hydroponics. I just want to share how I became interested in horticulture. I'd always loved being outside as a kid. Loved spending time in nature. When I was 13, my grandmother invited me to come and work in her garden. She said she would pay me to dig holes, to spread mulch, to pull weeds, and this was in Georgia. Anybody knows the nasty red clay that's down there. So maybe not necessarily fun work, but I enjoyed being outside and was looking forward to earning money. So I was happy to do it. Shortly after I started doing that, my grandmother showed me how to propagate plants from cuttings. I mean, I knew that you could grow plants from seeds, but I had no idea you could take a cutting of a plant and grow another plant. And that was it. I was hooked. I was just fascinated by horticulture and knew that's what I wanted to do. So my grandmother's the one that introduced me to horticulture. Always kind of share that story. When I speak or when I teach my classes, I will say, and forgive me if I get choked up, my grandmother actually just passed away about a week and a half ago. And I went down to Georgia for her funeral on Thursday. So it's only been 1 week since her funeral, but she's the one that inspired me to pursue horticulture. And so I would just encourage you to share your love of plants with people around you. You have no idea how it's going to impact others. So with that, we are actually talking about hydroponics. So what is hydroponics? I know those of you on this webinar probably have mixed backgrounds, mixed experiences. So for some of you, you already know a lot of the basics. Others may not really know much at all about hydroponics. So hydroponics is just referring to growing plants without soil in a soilless media or substrate using a nutrient solution. So if you think about growing plants in containers, like how we produce most ornamental plants that we're growing in greenhouses, we oftentimes refer to that as soilless production. And that's because we're not using a mineral-based soil in those containers. We're using components like peat moss and perlite and vermiculite. And so it's a soilless mix, but it's still like a loose fill, usually peat moss based media that we're growing in individual containers. And a lot of times we're not capturing any of the runoff. Some greenhouses are, some nurseries are, but many times they're not. So when we talk about hydroponics, it's still this soilless media or substrate, but as we'll see, it varies a little bit from how we're growing containerized plants. And we're providing those plants with a nutrient solution. This is key. It's not just water. Some people say hydroponics is growing plants in water, and that's not really accurate, because plants wouldn't grow very well in pure water. They actually need those nutrients. So what are some of the advantages of hydroponic production? I want to just maybe give a caveat here, or sort of a disclaimer, that I don't think hydroponic production is going to completely replace all other forms of production. I think there's still certainly a place for soil-based culture of all types of plants. And so hydroponics is an option. And there are a lot of times it makes sense. There are many times it doesn't make sense. And so I think I just want to say that I'm not suggesting that we're going to replace all soil-based farming. If we think about growing corn or soybeans, most of our agronomic crops, it makes sense to grow those in the ground. But some of the advantages of hydroponics, we're using less water. Now, as you'll see, it may require a lot of water to actually start with hydroponics, but we're capturing most of that, and we are reusing it. So we're consuming or using up less water. Many of these systems actually serve to minimize labor, not all of them. We'll touch on that a little bit. This third point's maybe not as important, but some of the systems that rely on large volumes of water can help moderate temperature swings to some extent. The fact that we're growing plants out of the soil certainly helps with food safety. We've removed the soil from the environment, and so that's helping to keep clean crops, and it also helps from like a disease standpoint to keep the soil-borne diseases just out of those environments. And so another advantage, and this is huge, but we'll see this is also a disadvantage, is that hydroponics allows immediate adjustments to fertility, which allows you to fine-tune crop growth. So there's no lag when you apply fertilizer to the soil, to your lawn, to your shrubs in the garden, whatever it is. Unless it's a liquid-based fertilizer, it takes some time before those plants can take it up. But even with the liquid-based fertilizer, there's still sort of a lag in that nutrient uptake. And with hydroponics, it's immediately available to the crops. So some disadvantages, some of the systems require more labor than soil-based cultures. So not all hydroponics are, reducing labor. Sometimes it actually can be still labor intensive. A key point is that power failure, so power loss for any reason, can result in crop failure. This hits close to home for me, not because I'm growing hydroponically, but just the other day, I think it was actually, today is Thursday, this might have been Tuesday or Wednesday at our house, our power just went out for no apparent reason. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening, no bad weather, nothing, the power just went out. Now we have a backup generator and it ran for about 3 hours until the power came back on. But if you're growing hydroponically, a power failure can result in total crop loss. If you're growing plants in the soil, they're buffered from this, right? Like you're not in a field, you're not worried about electricity other than maybe to run an irrigation pump. But even then, there's usually reserves of water in the soil. And so this is something to keep in mind, especially for large commercial growers, is it's critically important that they have backup generators for their production. This last point I said could be an advantage and a disadvantage, that the advantage being that we can make immediate fertility adjustments. The disadvantage is that frequent water quality and fertility monitoring is required, and it's more intense than what we would do with field-grown crops. So maybe for some of you, you've done a soil test, maybe for your lawn, maybe for your vegetable garden, and if you do that, it probably at most is once a year. And so for a grower in a soil-based production system, they're maybe looking at the nutrient levels in the soil, and they may do that weekly, they may do that monthly through the life of the crop. But with hydroponics, we're doing this daily, sometimes multiple times a day in large production systems. Now, I will give another disclaimer that I think my title was something like From Industry to Home Use. I'm focusing mostly on industry because that's where my experience comes from, and I think that's really exciting. Certainly, there's applications of this to home use, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. So you can grow hydroponically on a small scale at home. But what I'm showing you is more of kind of an insider view into what's happening sort of on a commercial scale in the industry. And so not all of this would directly apply to home use, and I'll try to kind of touch on that as we go through. So I mentioned hydroponics is a soilless system, right? We're using the substrate or media. We tend to use the term substrate when it comes to hydroponics, and media more for like soilless containerized culture to grow poinsettias or mums or whatever in a greenhouse. The terms can be interchangeable, but we typically say substrate with hydroponics. And so when we talk about this substrate, it can come in different forms. And so some of the most common would be rock wool, like what you see down here at the bottom. So these small little cubes that come in sort of a mat that you can break apart. This is where we would start seeds. We see larger cubes, larger blocks like this on the bottom right-hand side, and we would transplant into those. And that is literally what it sounds like. Well, not literally, because it's not rock wool, but think fiberglass insulation. If you've ever put up fiberglass insulation in walls, it's kind of like that. This is rock that they've melted down, they've blown out into these long fibers. They apply a glue or a binder to it, they compress it down, and they cut it into the various forms. I actually had the opportunity to tour the Grodan factory in the Netherlands and see them making this. It's pretty fascinating. And so it is simply rock and glue. That's all it is. And you could imagine there's not a lot of nutritional value in this rock wool substrate. Some other products that we use, things like expanded clay, like what you see in the bottom left-hand picture. Some synthetic bonded materials, like the upper right-hand picture. This is sort of like if you've ever done flower arranging, that oasis that you stick flowers into, it's kind of similar to that. The difference with this is it's more foamy. So with the oasis, if you smash it, it doesn't bounce back. It sort of crumbles. And with these, this is more like a phenolic foam. And so you can squeeze it and it returns to its original shape. We'll see this sometimes used with like peat-based medias where they apply a binder to it to keep it together. Sometimes we'll use perlite, like this white material in the upper center picture. And then cocoa core or cocoa fiber, that's what you see in this white bag. It's in this bag or this slab with little openings cut into it. Kind of similar to peat moss, but longer fibers. And it's a byproduct of the coconut industry. So those are some of the substrates. Yes.
Ben has a question in the chat about using solar energy as a main power source.
Yeah, so using solar energy, there are some options, right? And we'll talk just a little bit in a few slides about where we grow hydroponically. We can do that in a greenhouse. We can do that in a fully indoor environment. We don't do it typically outdoors. So typically we're not doing this just like outdoors, like an outdoor nursery. So if we put our crops in a greenhouse, then there is some issue with putting solar panels on the greenhouse because then we're blocking the sun, right? So we could have freestanding solar panels that are collecting that solar energy, and we're using that to power pumps, for example, maybe to run supplemental lights or to run fans in the greenhouse. So that's an option. A lot of indoor farms are vertical farms, and we'll see an example of that in a bit. We'll put solar panels on the roof because they're providing sole source lighting to the plants. The plants are inside, think a warehouse, right? So like they're inside, they're not receiving any sun. And so they can utilize the solar energy from panels on the roof or even, solar farms to utilize. There is a fairly new technology that's, I don't think this is commercial yet. And I'm probably going to mess up the name. I think it's photovoltaics, I believe is what it's called. And they're looking at incorporating, basically embedding within the polyethylene film on greenhouses or even greenhouse glass, embedding sort of translucent solar panels. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. And so essentially, when we think of the sun has a whole spectrum of wavelengths. And so not all wavelengths are necessary for plant growth. And so what they're looking at is, can they have this greenhouse plastic or film or glass that's intercepting wavelengths that are not needed for plant growth and actually converting that into electricity and then allowing the necessary wavelengths to pass through to the plants. And so that's a very new technology. Actually, Virginia Tech has just hired a greenhouse crop specialist who's starting next month. I think he's defending his dissertation this month. And he's coming from Michigan State University, and his research was looking at this. He was working with a professor looking at this technology. So yeah, certainly we can utilize, sorry, that was a very long answer to the question. We could utilize solar energy to help power some of what we need for hydroponics. So within hydroponics, I mentioned that we are using less water than soil-based culture most of the time. There are some systems, you see on this first bullet, I say the water/nutrient solution is usually recirculated. We refer to this as closed systems. Most hydroponic systems are closed systems, but not all are. For example, there are some systems that are open, some vertical systems, some tower systems where that water is pumped up, it runs down through like a column where the plants are planted into that, and it just runs out the bottom. And so systems like that are wasting water. So it'd be no different than a greenhouse where you're watering plants and the excess water drains out the pot and just runs out of the greenhouse. But most hydroponic systems are closed systems. They're capturing that. I would call it runoff. It's not really runoff because it doesn't run off. It doesn't leave the site, but they're capturing that excess nutrient solution and they're reusing it. And so in order to reuse it, we have to consider how we would treat that solution. There's a lot of issues here. So I just want to touch on a couple of things. Again, commercially, we think large greenhouses. You can imagine as you're pumping water through, you're irrigating crops, you're capturing what runs out, you're bringing that back to a central collection point. There may be some debris in that drain water or that nutrient solution coming back. Maybe some particles of media. There may be some pieces like some leaf tissue, something that fell in there. There could also be disease. So we could have disease-causing organisms that would then be pulled back into that water collection point. And so it's important that that water is treated. So we're not simply just pumping it around and around and around and never treating it. So there are various types of treatment systems, everything from filtering to remove particulate matter to looking at the nutrient solution itself. What is the balance of nutrients? How do we need to adjust that? And then reusing that water. And so in commercial systems, closed commercial systems, most of the time, the process of monitoring that water quality is automated, and it's happening really on a continuous basis. I worked in a greenhouse. It wasn't a hydroponic greenhouse, but we were injecting fertilizer into our irrigation lines, and we had meters that were in the lines that are constantly monitoring that solution as it's coming through. And so that's kind of how it is in commercial hydroponic systems, where they're monitoring and adjusting that on a regular basis. That could be daily for some growers. That's what we do here. When I'm teaching hydroponics, we're doing it daily. For others, though, it could be multiple times a day. So when we think about this monitoring and adjusting of the nutrient solution, certainly a large grower would have this automated. Other growers are doing this by hand, which is what we do here at the university. You can buy a meter similar to this one. I am not promoting Blue Lab. I actually don't use Blue Lab. I use Hanna Instruments meters just because that's what I've purchased, but I also am not endorsing them over anyone else. You can buy very cheap meters on Amazon, but we typically use combination meters that are measuring EC, which is electrical conductivity, and that's a measure of the total nutrients in the solution. It's beyond the scope of this presentation and the time we have today to go in depth in that, but it's a very quick measurement. It's just telling you the total nutrients. Doesn't tell you how much nitrogen versus potassium versus phosphorus versus micronutrients, but it's a total measure. And that gives us a benchmark for how we can adjust our nutrition. So we're measuring EC, and then we're also measuring pH, and we'll look at that in just a second. One last thing I don't actually have listed here is we also measure temperature. Temperature is important because as you'll see in a minute, the roots are either bathed in the nutrient solution or being constantly supplied with that nutrient solution. And so some crops are sensitive to warm temperatures or cold temperatures. And so for certain crops, it's important that we maintain a certain temperature of the nutrient solution. So that's another thing that we measure. I would imagine most of you guys have probably seen a chart like this one, where it's looking at nutrients that are necessary for plant growth, and then the relationship of the availability of those nutrients to the pH. And so when we look at this, oftentimes when we talk about soil-based culture or even soilless culture in containers and greenhouses or nurseries, growing shrubs, growing flowers, we talk about a fairly neutral pH. So something oftentimes slightly acidic. So you see neutral being 7. So we might shoot for somewhere around 6.5. Now, I pulled this chart off the internet. I did not create this. I don't want you to leave here with this understanding that all hydroponics should have a pH of 5.8, okay, or that all soil-based production should have a pH of 6.5. It does depend on your soil. It depends on your crops. It depends on the fertilizer that you're applying. The basic point here, though, is when we look at hydroponic growing, we are usually targeting a more acidic pH than what we do with soil-based culture. And so oftentimes somewhere between 5.5 and 6. So more acidic than you would normally expect. And it's different growing crops in water or in this liquid nutrient solution than it is growing crops in soil. And so soil can hold on to nutrients, soil can buffer changes in that electrical conductivity or that pH, and water doesn't have that ability. And so we have a little bit of a difference here. So again, a reason for why we're measuring and adjusting on a regular basis, because those things fluctuate so much faster in water or in hydroponic systems than they do in soil-based culture. Okay, so some kind of behind the scenes pictures, commercial settings. This is Red Sun Farms in Dublin, Virginia. I was about to say Dublin, Georgia. I grew up in Georgia, in Watkinsville, Georgia, just outside of Athens, and actually lived in Dublin, Georgia for a couple of years earlier in my life. So every once in a while I'll slip up and say Dublin, Georgia, but Dublin, Virginia is where Red Sun Farms is located. A large hydroponic greenhouse producing, I think, exclusively tomatoes. I believe they did peppers for a while, but I think they're exclusively doing tomatoes right now. So I mentioned that hydroponics is using less water than soil-based culture. Don't misunderstand me. It takes huge volumes of water to grow hydroponically. And so when you look at these tanks, that perspective is not great because of how you're looking at this. That tank is actually a lot tall. Maybe it looks tall to you. I don't know. Maybe it looks short because it looks like the man is about half the height of the tank, and that's not true. He's maybe a third the height of the tank. So these are tall tanks, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. The difference here is that water's pumped out to the greenhouse to irrigate the crops, and then it's brought back. And so the only water they lose is what the crops take up in anything that evaporates. And so there's nothing running off. So they still require large volumes of water. They're just using on a daily basis small volumes of water. So we have water storage tanks like this, extensive water treatment systems. I mentioned how we have to treat that recirculated nutrient solution. And so there's lots of different ways to do this, lots of filtering that takes place. This happens to be a UV treatment station. And so one of the ways you can treat reused irrigation water is by running it through a UV system where ultraviolet light is surrounding the tubes, penetrating, and it's in theory killing everything in there. So any disease-causing microorganisms that are present or any algae, things like that, it would be killing all of that in the water. So there's lots of different ways to do this, and the systems vary depending on how the greenhouse is set up and what their needs are. So in those large tanks that we saw a minute ago, those large silver tanks, that's holding water. What you see in these blue tanks in the background, these are concentrated fertilizer solutions. And this is a fertilizer injector. And so what's happening is the system's monitoring that electrical conductivity, that pH, and it's injecting fertilizer. So it's injecting this concentrate from one of these tanks into the lines and supplying that out to the greenhouse. And so each tank contains a different stock solution. So you have different nutrients in this tank than you do in this tank than you do in this tank. Oftentimes they'll have two nutrient solution tanks, like an A tank and a B tank. And then this could be acid, where they're injecting acid to adjust pH, because most of the time, not always, most of the time in hydroponics, your pH is creeping up. It's becoming more basic, and you have to adjust it back down more acidic. So a lot of operations will inject acid into the water to lower the pH. But you see very expensive, involved systems to grow commercially. So what I want to share with you is just a little bit here about the sort of different types of systems we would use for these different crops. We'll look at each of these systems a little bit, and then we'll sort of talk about production of leafy crops versus the production of fruiting crops. And so I'll show you on the next slide some pictures of these systems, but we think about leafy greens. And when I say leafy greens, we're talking about lettuce, we're talking about herbs, we're talking about microgreens, non-fruiting crops, okay? These crops would be grown typically in one of these systems. Commercially, the most common are float systems, which go by different names. So float is the same as raft, is the same as deep water culture, which you may see abbreviated as DWC, which is the same as deep water flow. So they're all different names for really the same thing. The idea is we're floating crops on a pool of nutrient solution. So that's a very common system, both commercially. We use it in our teaching systems here at Virginia Tech, and you can grow like this at home as well in a small scale system. Not in any particular order, but the other main commercial system would be nutrient film technique, usually just abbreviated as NFT. And this is actually an NFT system in the upper right-hand corner. We'll come back to this, but there's a reservoir underneath this. These little channels are elevated. You see this small white line. We call this like a drip line or supply line. Sometimes people call it spaghetti line because it's very thin. This is coming up, and it's coming into the upper end of this channel. What you can't tell from the picture is these channels are pitched. So there's a little bit of a slope. It's like a 1% slope, where this far end is a little bit lower than this upper end. And so this is pumped up, and then it just gravity flows through this channel, runs as a film of nutrients across the bottom of that channel. And so this is another important commercial system, but also can be used very small scale. So we use these also for teaching systems. Then we have some other systems here, ebb and flow. We'll see that in a minute. Towers or vertical systems. And then aeroponics or root misting. This is where you're just misting the nutrient solution onto the roots. There is one grower, Aero Farms, who's using this commercially, but to my knowledge, they're the only grower that's using that on a large commercial scale. So in contrast, if we look at fruiting crops, so the example that we have here is tomato, but we could also think of cucumbers, eggplants. I don't know who really likes eggplants. I'll eat them if you cut them up in really small pieces, but I don't like the texture. It's kind of weird for me. But eggplants, peppers, cucumbers, tomatoes, all fruiting crops. And so collectively, we refer to the systems used for growing those as high wire systems. I think you can see this if you look closely. There's these little white strings that we refer to as the wires that are going up. They come from the crop all the way up to the framework of the greenhouse, and we're training those crops on those. And we'll see some examples in a few minutes. And so the two main types of high wire systems for fruiting crops are Dutch buckets, sometimes referred to as Beto buckets, and gutter systems. And so this is a gutter system. We'll see some more details as we go. So to just kind of quickly show this in a very simple diagram, I think this kind of helps understand how some of these different systems work. I know we didn't mention all of these, but if you're looking at this first nutrient film technique, again, the reservoir is down here. You see it pumping the solution up. And there's a thin film. You can sort of see a stream running through this channel and out the other end. And so the roots are growing inside of that channel. They're not submerged in nutrient solution. It's actually not even as deep as what it appears here. It's really just a film of nutrient solution running across the bottom of that channel. Deep water culture, which I said is also float or raft or deep water float, we're kind of removing this whole pump system, and we're just putting the plants in the nutrient solution, right? We're just floating them right on top of that solution, and their roots grow down in here. Now, you do see on the NFT system over here, this air stone, so we're aerating this. Some systems don't need that. There's enough aeration that happens when the solution flows back in. But for sure, on float or deep water culture, we're having to aerate that solution. We're adding oxygen to the solution so that the plant roots have oxygen because they need that, right? In the interest of time, I'll skip wick systems. Ebb and flow, we're just pumping that up, and we're flooding a table or a bed of media, which is wicking up to water the crops, and then it drains back out. Drip systems, think of this as like the gutter systems where the crops are sitting on a gutter in some sort of media, and we're dripping into, you see this, the supply lines dripping directly into each of the plants, and then that excess flows out. And then aeroponics is just misting that solution onto the roots. So those are some of the different systems to kind of help you, if you've not seen these before, to help kind of wrap your mind around this. So I just include this picture to be totally clear. When we talk about hydroponics, again, soilless production using a nutrient solution, typically in a greenhouse, sometimes in a fully indoor environment. This is not using soil. This is not happening outdoors. And so these things like just typical field-based production or even plasticulture or using high tunnels are certainly methods for growing crops, but this has nothing to do with hydroponics, right? So when we think about hydroponic production, we typically do this either in greenhouses or fully controlled indoor environments, oftentimes referred to as vertical farms. So I have kind of separated out the systems that if we're growing in a greenhouse, you see some of the systems we might use. If we're growing in a fully controlled indoor environment, more commonly we would use these systems. This is a generalization. I am certainly not saying that you can't use aeroponics in a greenhouse or you can't use a tower in an indoor farm, but typically this is kind of how we see that split out.
Josh,
so if we think of, yes, Deb.
Virginia asks, which of those systems requires less monitoring than the others?
Oh, that's a good question. So let's see if I can back up to this. So if we look at these, like the easiest system that requires the least monitoring, that's kind of the most foolproof, would be this deep water culture or float system. A couple of reasons for this. Literally, the plants are floating in the nutrient solution. So if you have a power loss, it's less of an issue. It means your air stone's not being powered, and so slowly the solution is losing oxygen, but the plants don't dry out. This typically has the largest reservoir of nutrient solution, which helps to kind of buffer some of those pH and EC changes. So this one I would say is probably the easiest and requires the least amount of input or adjustments. When we look at things like the NFT, for example, you can check the nutrient solution once a day, but I mean, it's not enough to like know that this pump was working in the morning. If that pump clogs or you use electricity, this system could fail very quickly. So I would say the deep water culture or the float's probably the easiest to adjust and to monitor and to work with in general. It's also probably the cheapest to build. So if you're building one, it's a fairly inexpensive system. So real quickly, if we look at greenhouses, you guys have all seen certainly a greenhouse before. Greenhouses are spread out horizontally. We're relying on the sun. So this is why we use different systems typically in a greenhouse than we would in an indoor or vertical farm. Here we are not relying on the sun. If you look at the roof of aero farms, it is a solid flat roof. There's no skylights. It's not a glass roof. This is the inside, right? It's a typical warehouse looking roof, and they're supplying all the light directly to the crops. So in this case, Since we're not relying on the sun, we stack the systems. We don't need them to be horizontal anymore. We can stack them and make more efficient use of the space. And so we typically use different types of systems here. If you just think sort of, I say logistically about this, if you think about the weight, if you were to have float systems with large reservoirs of water stacked one on top of another, this would get very heavy and more likely to tip over. And so things like NFT or aeroponics, where you're just misting nutrient solution, uses a smaller volume of solution and it's less weight on these systems. So that's kind of why we see those differences in production. Devin, correct me if I'm wrong. I think officially I have 10 minutes and then we want to stop for questions. Is that right?
I don't know that we announced an official time, Josh. So I think
Okay.
If we leave about 10 minutes at the end, so maybe like 10, 11, 20, I think that'll be fine.
Okay. All right. I will try to speed through what I have left. I think I've packed too much into this. So real quickly, systems for leafy greens, again, coming back to this mainly float or deep water culture and nutrient film technique. Main reasons for this and why we don't use fruiting crops in these systems are that fruiting crops get tall. They have larger root systems. They grow for a longer period of time. And you could imagine the roots like filling up these channels, really getting large here. If you think about a tomato plant that's, even just like 3 feet tall with tomatoes on it, if you're trying to float that on a raft, it may become unbalanced and it tips over. The same thing with these channels, they may just tip over. So typically we're not growing fruiting crops in these systems. We're reserving them for leafy crops that are fast growing, that are low, and that don't have a lot of weight, right? So those are some of the systems we use. These pictures, these two upper pictures are from the teaching greenhouses here at Virginia Tech. These are students growing lettuce. So they grew this lettuce. I'm pretty proud of them. I think they did a nice job. They grew some very uniform lettuce in these systems. We use a raft like this. It's a EPS or expanded polystyrene styrofoam. This happens to be made by Beaver Plastics, but you can certainly go buy, you could reuse styrofoam, right? If you get some styrofoam in a box and you want to cut holes in it and float your plants, you could do that. You could go buy that rigid foam board insulation from like Lowe's or Home Depot and cut holes in it. That works as well. And so with these float systems, it's just what it sounds like. We're just floating crops. And so for smaller scale, like what we're using for teaching, this is our setup. We have these individual frames that hold a reservoir of nutrient solution. And so you can make this, realistically, you could take like a Rubbermaid storage container, right? Float a small piece of styrofoam on it. So you don't need a large system. If we look commercially though, we now see like entire greenhouses, it's just a pool of nutrient solution. And so they'll have like a concrete border, and this might be anywhere from 6 to like 18 inches deep. So it's not super deep. And they'll just flood the entire, fill that whole thing with nutrient solution and float these rafts directly on it. And so that's what that could look like in a large scale system. And you see the lettuce here starting to grow, like in the background, just transplanted. And as it's moving forward, getting larger and ready for harvest. And so with these float systems commercially, they're just pushing them across. And so they're harvesting from the other end of this greenhouse. And as they sow more seeds, they push the rafts on from this end and they just push it across. So you're not picking up pots or trays and moving them around. So this is a fairly low labor system, right? It works pretty well. Doesn't require huge amounts of labor. The other main system for leafy greens, the NFT or nutrient film technique, the picture on the left is from the research center in Danville. So the Institute for Advanced Learning and Research, they have a controlled environment ag research station there. And this is in that greenhouse with various NFT systems. And so again, you see the nutrient solution pumped in through this small tube. It drains through those channels, and then there's a collection sort of gutter on this other end, and it drains back into the reservoir below where it's recirculated and pumped back up again. And so these are recirculating systems. But if you look real closely inside of this, you can just sort of see a shimmer. There's just a thin film of solution that runs across the bottom of that. And so a very common system for leafy green production. These can come in larger systems, like we can get
Oh gosh,
12 and 24 and 36 and 48 and 72 channel NFT systems, and we can have entire greenhouses filled up. These are still NFT. Real closely, you see black drippers over here coming into it. So we can have entire greenhouses filled with NFT systems. We're going to sort of skip through this, but there's a producer in
What happened? God. Joshua, you look like you're muted. Oh, he's muted. He's down.
All right, you can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize, guys. Don't know what happened. You'd think with all the years of teaching through COVID, right, I'd have this down, but it apparently kicked me out and I rejoined, and so now I'm back. I was just saying, entire commercial greenhouses filled with NFT systems. This can be automated. We're going to skip that in the interest of time. So real quickly, propagation of leafy crops.
You're not sharing your screen.
I'm not sharing my screen. Good night. Okay. I'm sorry, guys. Guess when it booted me out, I had to redo everything. Okay, you see.
My internet connection was unstable.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. So you see my screen, right? Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Okay. Propagation of leafy crops here. So we're starting these from seed. And oftentimes we're transplanting into the final system. So things like the float systems, we'll start these in as seeds in small little blocks here, and then we'll transplant them in. Sometimes some growers are direct sowing, but it's always starting from seed. That's the important thing. And usually growers are starting their own transplants for leafy crops. They're not buying these in. It doesn't make sense to spend money to buy hundreds of thousands of lettuce transplants and have them shipped. And so growers are typically doing their own transplant production. So two main systems for fruiting crops. Mentioned this already, but Dutch buckets or Beto buckets, that's what you see here in this right-hand picture. And these gutter systems where we have bags or slabs of media sitting on a gutter. These are typically not used for leafy crops because there's sort of more infrastructure here. These Dutch buckets have large volumes for root growth. These slabs have large volumes for root growth, and we just don't need that for leafy, or excuse me, for fruiting. Excuse me, we do not need that for leafy crops. We need that for these fruiting crops. They're longer term production cycles. They're bigger plants. So a very simplified diagram of what a Dutch bucket system looks like. You still have the reservoir of nutrient solution. You're pumping up. It's dripping directly into each container with a plant. This is oftentimes filled with perlite. The excess is running out into a return line and then sent back to the reservoir. So it's still a recirculating system, but you see a fairly large reservoir of media, which means a large reservoir of nutrient solution for the plants. So with Dutch buckets, the substrate typically going to be something like perlite or sometimes this expanded clay. Usually this is only used once and it's replaced for each crop. So again, long-term crops, something like tomato, cucumber, it's still used for a season and then it's replaced. We don't typically use things like vermiculite or peat because they retain too much water and they have a lot of small particles that can clog filters and cause problems. So just a few pictures of some Dutch bucket production in greenhouses. These happen to be Dutch buckets elevated onto gutters, so they're off the ground, but still the plants growing in Dutch buckets themselves. And then the white strings are those wires that you see going vertically, and the cucumbers are trained on those as they grow. So we can grow strawberries, we can grow eggplants, we can grow tomatoes, we can do peppers, we can do cucumbers, lots of different crops that we can grow in Dutch buckets. And these tend to be used a little bit more by smaller growers and a little less so by larger commercial growers. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to move through this. I will share a PDF of this so you guys will have access to all the text on the slides. Gutter systems, oftentimes formed on site. If you've ever had seamless gutters installed, they bring the machine and they're rolling out the metal and forming the gutter on site, so there's no seams. So this is kind of a similar process where they're taking this plastic material and they're putting it through the former and doing that there on site. You see a brand new greenhouse being built with gutters installed. Now you see the slabs of media placed on top of the gutters. And that substrate is usually going to be either in a slab like this or a bag, and typically something like rock wool or cocoa fiber. And so it just sits on top of that gutter. There's holes in the bottom or along the bottom edges, and excess solution runs out and down into this channel or this gutter and all the way down to the end, and it's captured and recirculated. And so with these, they're putting the plants on top of that, and the roots are growing down into the slab underneath. I'll skip through and try to get this wrapped up here, but you see various crops being grown in these gutter systems. Again, high wire crops being trained up. Tomatoes are the most common crop being grown, but anything like cucumbers or peppers can be produced in this way. So mentioned Red Sun Farms, just a couple of pictures of what they're doing. You see as the plants grow, they're training them on these strings, and they're actually accumulating all the stems of the tomatoes as they grow down there around the gutter. Usually they're using lifts to access the plants because they're growing vertically above that. And so gutter systems used mostly commercially by growers. Real quickly, propagation of fruiting crops. I just have a couple of slides left and I'll wrap this up. Propagation of fruiting crops still by seed, so not by cuttings. The difference here is that if we look at a crop like cucumber, cucumber is just planted by seed. It grows very quickly, as I imagine most of you guys know. Some growers propagate their own, some growers buy them in, but cucumbers will be transplanted often at about this stage of like 3 to 4 leaves, and they're transplanted into those systems. If we look at tomatoes, though, tomatoes are most often grafted for greenhouse production. Grafting is a very involved process. The stage of development of those plants is critical. And it's important. While you can certainly graft yourself, I mean, I've given presentations on how you can graft yourself. Commercially, growers are buying in grafted transplants. They're not trying to graft their own. And so just a few pictures that show kind of the grafting process and growing these transplants to go into a greenhouse. And so lastly, on propagation, for propagation of any hydroponic crop, regardless of leafy or fruiting crops, very important that we have uniformity, we have clean crops. We want to look at successive propagation, especially for leafy crops, because we're planting and harvesting on a quick scale. I mean, oftentimes like 4 to about 5 weeks, and we're just continually planting new seeds so that we can come in behind those crops. And I know I've mentioned a few things throughout the talk about home production of hydroponics. I show you a few systems here that are on smaller scale. And so there are systems like the one on the left-hand side down here where it's including lights. There's a nutrient solution reservoir down here, a tower where you're planting your plants and it's supplying lights, countertop units like this, tower modules that you could put on your back patio or your back deck. I've seen people build, I've had students build systems similar to this. It's sort of a modified NFT system using PVC pipe and build them on their back decks. And so lots of things you can do with hydroponics. So I hope this has been informative. I do apologize that I rushed through a lot of that, but I will share the PDF with Devin. She'll share that with you guys if you need access to those slides. And with that, I appreciate you attending, and any questions that I've not already answered, I'm happy to attempt to answer now.
Thanks so much, Josh. Yes, all of this will be posted on the website, and I'll paste the link again if anyone needs it, where the recording and any handouts or presentation materials go. We do have a few questions. One that I've seen a few people ask is, where can you go if you want like a recipe book or like a list of what crops need what kinds of nutrients?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that a lot of the resources that you see may be geared commercially, but you can still adapt that. I would caution you though, if you're looking online, always consider the source, right? So there's, you can Google something about hydroponics, especially when you start talking about hydroponics for home use, and you may find a lot of anecdotal information that maybe is based on somebody's experience, but maybe they actually don't have any education or experience doing this. They're just sort of writing about it. So just be careful where you look. I will say that Devin, you may actually know this. I'm not certain when this will be available, but I know there were a group of faculty here working on some resources on hydroponic production. Former Dr. Latimer, who has retired, Dr. Scoggins was involved with this. Amber Velaton is involved with it. And I think there are videos coming out and a good bit of information that would be available through the VCE website. I don't know how soon that's coming out. Sorry, that's not like a great exactly where to go. I am plugging VCE that soon there will be some stuff.
I'm adding it to my list to check on the status of that. And that's definitely a resource. That's something that we would put in like the biweekly update if there's new resources like that.
Real quickly, maybe other like Crop King is a supplier of a lot of systems, and I think they have a fairly decent blog. I think they have some good information on their website. So Crop King would be a place to go also.
All right, we have a few more questions. I don't know if we're going to get to all of these, so I'll go from the beginning. Carol wants to know about the stacked indoor systems if humidity builds up in the layers.
Yeah, so with the indoor systems, what happens, I didn't go into all these details, but yeah, humidity control is an issue. You can imagine even with NFT where there's not huge volumes of water, but bringing all that stuff indoors with plants are transpiring, right? They're releasing lots of moisture back into the air. And so a couple of things that happens, one, commercially, they're most often air conditioning those facilities because the lights themselves are adding some heat, not lots of heat, but they're adding some heat. And so then they're actually having to run air conditioner. And when they do, a function of air conditioning is not just cooling the air, but actually dehumidifying the air. That's why you have a condensate drain on your air conditioner. And so that's actually helping to dehumidify the air. But a lot of facilities will also run dehumidifiers. They'll run similar to a greenhouse, like horizontal airflow fans. So they're circulating air through the facility to help minimize like disease pressure and things like that. So certainly humidity can be an issue, yeah, in those stacked indoor systems.
Okay, and if you are wanting to grow, for example, both leafy and a fruiting crop, would you need two separate systems?
You could probably do it with one system. I mean, you can certainly grow leafy crops in something like a gutter system using a slab or a bag. I mean, I've seen people do modified production of this where you take a bag of potting soil, hopefully high quality potting soil, lay it flat, poke holes in the bottom to let it drain, have some way to capture the excess solution running out, plant your plants in the top of it. So, you can grow leafy crops in those systems that we would typically use for fruiting crops. It doesn't work so well the other way around, right? If you try to plant a tomato plant or a pepper plant in a raft or an NFT, it tends to grow too big, it falls over, the roots clog the system up. So it can physically be done, putting leafy crops in with fruiting crops. You can have some differences in fertility requirements, but unless you're trying to do this commercially, it's not that critical, right? Like, I mean, a whole lot of people are going to water their houseplants all with the same fertilizer. You go fertilize your garden all with the same stuff. Now, some of you are very precise and you have different fertilizer for your leafy crops and different fertilizer for your fruiting crops. And so if it's in the same system, you don't have the ability to change the fertility. And in that case, I would focus more on the fertility needs of the fruiting crops. And with fruiting crops, you actually have two stages of production. You have the vegetative stage first before it actually starts to flower and fruit. And during that stage, the nutrient requirements are much more similar to the leafy crops. And then once it starts to flower and fruit, then the needs shift a little bit. And so at that stage, I would focus on the needs of the fruiting crops, and it's probably going to be okay for the leafy crops.
Josh, Michelle asks, for the Dutch bucket system, does the plastic need to be food safe, or does that matter?
If it matters to you, right? Again, I don't mean to be sarcastic at all. There's like a whole spectrum. I mean, there are people who don't know what BPA is, who don't care at all. There are people who want to stay away from plastic. I mean, my wife years ago got rid of all of our plastic food storage containers. Like, we don't use them. We use glass. I know I'm drinking out of a plastic cup right now. That's because it's kind of awkward to like drink out of my big water bottle over here. So it's up to you. I would say that it's probably a very small risk because you're talking about the roots being in contact. And so unless there's like a concern of the roots taking up something, but certainly if you're concerned about it, you can look at maybe trying to use either BPA free. I mean, you can buy 5-gallon buckets that are food grade 5-gallon buckets, right? So if whoever certifies that, if they say it's safe to put your food in it, then I'd say it's safe to grow your crops in it. And you can use 5-gallon buckets for Dutch buckets. There's lots of information online about setting up Dutch buckets using 5-gallon buckets.
And Carol asks, how do you keep algae from growing inside gutters, buckets, etc.?
Yeah, so lots of other aspects of management of these systems. It can be a problem. So one of the things, like when you're doing leafy crops, typically we're seeing commercially like 4 to 5 week cycles on the crops. And so some growers are just cleaning between each cycle. Some growers are adding a low level of disinfectant into the nutrient solution. There are products that are labeled to be added or injected into irrigation water or added into hydroponic systems that are like low enough it's not affecting the health of the plants, but it's helping to keep those things in check. One of the biggest, though, is you're going to have to just clean it from time to time, right? If you have water, you have nutrients, and you have light, eventually you're going to have algae. And so just sort of keeping that clean. If you're doing something like a float system, trying to cover the whole surface of the water, I can tell you from experience last year that we did not transplant all of our lettuce into the rafts at the same time. And so those rafts have those little like square cutouts. And in about a week, we had algae growing in squares on the bottom of the reservoir for the raft system because the sunlight was going through those holes and you have nutrient solution in there. So keeping that surface covered is going to help, right? That's one of the biggest things you can do.
That's very interesting. All right, we're out of time. I see Virginia asked about lighting. I actually think artificial lighting might be a good, maybe we'll see if we can get somebody to do a whole presentation on that, because we've gotten a lot of questions. And actually in the new handbook, Kathleen and I spent a long time trying to figure out what to do about artificial lighting. So that might be a whole presentation on its own.
Yeah.
All of this will be posted online. Like I said, thanks everybody for coming. And Josh, thank you so much for sharing with us, and just condolences from all of us on your grandma as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're here for you if we can help you in any way.
No, I had 42 great years with her, lots of wonderful memories. And so I'm able to happily share that she's the one that introduced me to horticulture. I wasn't just the first time I've shared that, so I wasn't really sure if I'd make it through it. But I think, again, just reflecting on all those positive memories it was fantastic. So thank you.
It's a great story. Okay, thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you in August for forest health updates with Lori Chamberlain.
All right, bye. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Josh.